All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for day number one of the NMFMA 2022 Local Food Connects annual conference. We're excited that you are able to attend, and we hope that you take away a lot of valuable information from the presentation today. The first thing that I'm going to ask you all to do is put yourselves on mute. You all entered as participants, which means you have access, you have the ability to control your video and your audio. So please make sure that you are on mute. Also, we will go through and mute anybody that we need to, just in case, to make things go smoothly. So I'm Michael Green, and I am a program, I'm the Good Food NM coordinator for the New Mexico Farmers Marketing Association. And this week, I'm going to be one of the tech assistants. My colleague, Sophia Rose, will also be a tech assistant for the duration of the conference. So that's kind of why I'm talking to you right now. So before we get started with the fun stuff, I'm going to cover some of the housekeeping items that will make the conference go more smoothly. We're going to be using the same Zoom link through the entire conference, so be sure to keep it handy. You'll also receive a daily email with links and important documents, as well as the agenda each day. Please hold on to this so you know what to expect and so you have the Zoom link handy. On your Zoom screen, you're going to see three important buttons at the bottom of the window. You're going to see chat, reactions, and leave meeting. You're going to use these three buttons throughout the conference. In the chat, feel free to introduce yourselves, ask questions, make comments, ask for technical help, etc. After you open the chat screen at the bottom, just above the text box where you type, you'll see a drop-down menu where you can choose who to send a message to. Please select Send to Attendees and Panelists. This way, everyone will be able to see the questions that you're asking. We'll make sure that we'll be able to get those answered as well. Also down at the bottom of the screen, you're going to see the reactions button. This is going to allow you to raise your hand. Please use the raise the hand feature if you have a question during the Q&A only. Please do not use the raise the hand during the presentation. During the Q&A, the moderator or the tech assistant will call on participants who raise their hands, and at that point, you'll be able to unmute yourself to ask the questions that you might have. And then finally, at the bottom of the screen, you're going to see a button that says Leave Room. This Leave Room button will allow you to exit the session. So we encourage you to leave the room during the lunch break and at the end of the day. We're going to be doing the we have a lunch break in the middle, so I would say just go ahead and leave the meeting and click the same link and you'll be able to come back for the afternoon sessions. Let's see, I kind of mentioned this already, but you've all entered the rooms as active participants, which means you have control of your audio and your video. We love to see your smiling faces, so feel free to keep your camera on. However, we would appreciate your help in allowing the speakers to be heard clearly, so please keep yourselves on mute unless the moderator or a tech assistant calls on you during the Q&A. If you have any tech issues, feel free to give me a call. I will drop my contact information in the chat here in just a second. That way you can have access to it. It's also on the daily email that goes out as well as the website. Let's see. All right, so now for the fun stuff. I just wanted to remind you all that for active New Mexico Farmers Marketing Association members that are in good standing, don't forget to vote for the new board members. So voting to fill the positions will open on later today, later today at 1:30, and will close on Friday, February 25th at 5 p.m. So please remember to vote. You are in good standing. You will receive a link for those of you who are able to vote. So you will receive that link in the email so you can vote. All right, now finally, I'm going to give you a quick rundown for today's sessions. So from 9 to 11 a.m., Dr. Porter Swentzell is going to tell us about the historical and cultural perspectives on agriculture in New Mexico. We're going to have a break from 11 to 12. We'll come back from 12 to 1 with the New Mexico Farmers Marketing Association Executive Director, Denise Miller, which is going to be giving us the state of the plate. Then we are going to hear from 1 to 1:30 from the NMFMA board president, Jedrick Land, and also candidates who are running for open positions for the board. And then from 1:30 to 3:30, Sarah Silva will be discussing tools that can ease conflict, invite inclusivity, and will learn ways to make decisions quickly and through a consensus. So that's kind of a summary of what to expect today. So now I'm going to hand it off to the NMFMA Executive Director, Denise Miller, who's going to do the land acknowledgement, and then also welcome. So thank you all for joining. Let me know if there's anything I can help you with.
Great, thank you, Michael. Thanks for doing that. And hello, everyone. It's really good to see you, and we appreciate you making time in your busy schedules. We're always happy to see new faces and old friends. And it just occurred to me, I think one thing Michael might not have said is that if you want to put your organization, your farmers market, or your organization affiliation next to your name in your little square, that would be great, so that people can connect your face with where you're from. And you can do that by, if you hover over your square, you'll see 3 dots in the corner, and one of the options there is rename. And then you can just put either the name of your farmer's market or where you live or anything that helps identify you. That would be terrific. And as Michael said, I'm Denise Miller, the Executive Director of the Farmers Marketing Association. And I really wish we were all meeting in person, but at least we have an alternative way to gather. Hopefully this is the last year we'll be doing a full-on virtual conference, but you never know. So before we get started with our program this morning and our 24th annual conference, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. And I would also like to recognize that the following was adapted from several sources, including a speech by Maria Archuleta, who works for an organization called Embracing Equity. So, as we gather in this virtual space, we recognize that we are connected with one another through the winds that blow air into our lungs and through the waters that move deep into the earth and up into the sky. We acknowledge that the ground beneath our feet is historically the home of Indigenous peoples, many of whom have been forced to leave for other lands. For most of us who are here in New Mexico today, we acknowledge that our food and farming work is taking place on occupied Indigenous land of 23 tribes. It's important that we acknowledge the history and ongoing colonization of where we live and work here and in our country. It's also important to acknowledge our place in the story of colonization. We don't pretend to know the answers in undoing the ugly legacy of colonization, but at the very least, we can be accountable and deepen our understanding of our individual and our collective responsibility in fighting for change. As part of the NMFMA family and a citizen of New Mexico, we each have the opportunity to work for change. And if you'd like to take a minute to enter the name of the tribes who have lived in your location and share them with everyone, you can do that in the chat. I've also found that you can find good information about land acknowledgements all over the internet, really, but also at a place called nativegov.org. So thank you all for taking a moment to think about the land that we are on and all of that. So now I would like to turn it over to Juan Abeyta, who will introduce our keynote speaker and later facilitate the Q&A. Juan has been an integral part of a recent multi-partner, multi-year RFSP grant project that we started in 2021 to scale up the local food value chain. He's a collective impact specialist who lives in the South Valley. He's also a small, well, I don't know if he's a small farmer, but he has a small farm and he's an all-around great human being. Thank you, Juan, for joining us this morning and kicking off our programming.
Thanks for the intro, Denise. And just as part of the continuing my introduction here, they say that you are what you eat. So Denise mentioned I have a small farm, so I'm going to tell you what we grow here. Apples, apricots, arugula, artichokes, asparagus, blackberries, cilantro, corn, garlic chives, melon, mint, oregano, pears, plums, quince, and tomatoes. So that is part of what constitutes who I am. And as Denise mentioned, I'm on a small farm in the South Valley, and I come from an agricultural background. All my grandparents were farmers as well. So I'm very happy to be here with all of you and glad that we have this opportunity to share some information together. So I want to thank you all for joining us today. Your participation is crucial to building awareness of and advocacy for sustainable agriculture and food sovereignty. We are fortunate to live in a region where agriculture has been practiced for millennia. This area has one of the oldest agricultural traditions in North America. We have the unique opportunity to learn from that heritage, from that wisdom, from that relationship to land, water, and food. With our speaker, we will explore the historical and cultural perspectives on agriculture in New Mexico. Porter Swentzell is from Santa Clara, Pueblo, where he grew up participating in traditional life in the community and developed an interest in language and cultural preservation. He is an associate professor of Indigenous Liberal Studies at the Institute of American Indian Arts. He's a regent for Northern New Mexico College and serves on several nonprofit boards. Porter received his doctorate in Justice Studies from Arizona State University and is currently pursuing an MBA from Western New Mexico University. He enjoys weaving traditional Pueblo sash belts and learning about history in his free time. Porter lives in Santa Clara, Pueblo, along with his wife and 3 children. Please join me in welcoming Porter.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for that introduction, Juan. It's good to be here with you all and be giving a little bit of a presentation to start off your conference this week. And I know it's a bit of a, it's not as fun being online as it is to be in the room all together, gathering and talking together. And so over the last several years of the pandemic, I've come to rely a little bit heavily on PowerPoint because it has pictures and things like that. That's a little bit better than just seeing my head talking on the screen. So I'm gonna go ahead and share screen here, but it really is an honor to be here and be able to join you all this morning. So let's see. All right. You all can see that? All right, very good. Okay, so as Juan brought up, I'm from Santa Clara, Pueblo, which is one of the 6 Tewa-speaking villages in northern New Mexico. There's another Tewa-speaking village in Arizona on First Mesa in Hopi, but Santa Clara is one of the ones in New Mexico. And I always want to make sure before I go any further to also give credits to anything that I'm sort of talking about in this presentation, because I have worked over the years with archaeologists at Crow Canyon Archaeological Center and of course my academic learning. But when I was a little kid, my mom, who's pictured here on the right-hand side, who some of you may know because she's a fairly well-known artist here in northern New Mexico, a sculptor. But when I was a little kid, 2nd grade, she pulled me out of school, and for the next 8 years was homeschooled. And most of that time we grew our own food, and we were living without electricity at the Pueblo. And so those years spent irrigating, as you can see here, harvesting and planting and weeding and fixing fences and building fences and herding animals and all of that. And so that was a really transformational part of my education that sort of guided my thoughts as I come to you today. And of course, that tradition, as I'm about to talk to you all about, goes way back into time as far as figuring out how to be a farmer in a high desert landscape. And what does that mean, and what do we have to do? And many of you are very much engaged in that right now as part of the things that you all are doing. So I'm speaking to the choir here, so to speak. But of course, my mom continues to be a farmer, and those are my boys when they were a little bit younger. And they were helping grandma out that day with some harvesting. So that's something that the family is still involved in. And she has a seed bank where she stores seeds that are passed down through generations that come from the Pueblo here and from local communities, and shares those seeds to be grown out so that they can be carried on, right? So that perspective is really key to things I'm going to be talking about as the presentation goes on. So, but the first thing I want to talk about is agriculture, traditions, and the relationship to food. I want to be very clear that I'm not going to cover all cultural perspectives, and that's what I should have said on the last slide. I grew up at Santa Clara Pueblo, irrigating with the sun rising on the Sangre de Cristo mountain, so I'm not going to be describing all the perspectives, but so this is just one perspective, and it's linked into thinking about agriculture from the Pueblo communities of New Mexico, but specifically coming from my own perspective growing up at Santa Clara Pueblo. So, and that the story of agriculture really is linked in with corn, and it's a story of what I like to call ethnogenesis. And those two words are kind of, it's a combined word there that looks at how a people come to be, right? The genesis of a people and how that's tied in with agriculture in a very, very, very important way, right? So, but the first thing to recognize, and I always like to point this out when I'm talking with my students, is that it can't be underestimated and understated that food is the source of nutritional energy produced by the sun. In essence, the sun is producing energy, and that energy is being taken in by plants through photosynthesis, right? And that perhaps is consumed by other animals that then are consumed by us, right? Or we're consuming the plants directly, right? And even decomposing plants are feeding, all these different microbes, and it's generating all of this energy and life that's actually ultimately coming from the energy of the sun. So in essence, anything that we are eating, we are actually eating the sun. And without the sun, we don't exist in essence because of that energy. None of those things work together, right? So the sun is one of those things that is just so foundational to understanding where the energy of life comes from, right? But I like to point this out because not just Pueblo communities, but indigenous communities across the world have recognized photosynthesis, not called photosynthesis, but recognize the value of that, and to make sure and pay respect to the sun and pay respect to that which gives us the life to survive, right? So that us as measly little human beings actually are not really that important in the whole scheme of things, that we only exist due to the munificence, the giving of all the creatures and beings in the world that allow us to even be here, right? And so that recognition stretches back way into the depths of time. It's much older than agriculture, the understanding of where this energy comes from that keeps us going and allows us to sustain ourselves as the root of food in essence in many ways, right? But when we look at agriculture, there's a couple ways to think about it, and I always like to kind of point at the archaeological side of things, which is this very long history of domestication that stretches back many millennia and largely centered into the central part of Mexico, in the area around the Rio Balsas Valley, as it's known today, when about somewhere between 9,000 and 10,000 years ago or so, the dates keep shifting a little bit longer back in time, but we could say probably for sure around 9,000 years ago, there was the domestication of this tropical grass known as teosinte, right? Which you can see on the image on the right-hand side, it's a grass with a little grass head there, with each seed, each kernel being in its own individual husk, right? And through many centuries of engagement with this tropical grass, we get the domestication of maize, or maize, as many people call it, also known as corn, which is not really a great term, because originally that's a term that referred to all grains in English, like in England, right? But it's come to be applied to a particular plant more specifically. So this amazing transformation of this tropical grass about 9,000 years ago is what led to agriculture in this particular region that we're at now, right? But it took a really, really long time for a tropical grass to move up into this area and be able to grow in a profoundly non-tropical area like New Mexico, right? So we have this 4,000, 5,000 year time frame where maize is slowly moving up into this area. And the earliest evidence for maize in the southwestern area is near modern day Zuni, New Mexico, and it has been dated to about 4,200 years ago. So that's by at least 4,000 years ago, corn reaches the Southwest, right? Now, corn is just one of a group of different agricultural plants, domesticated plants. And so, of course, not forget about squash, which was domesticated perhaps around the same time as corn in central Mexico, about 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. And some of the earliest evidence for it is found in this region about 3,000 years ago. So slowly moving up. These would be winter squash type squash with a hard shell because it lasts longer. And also I always like to point out that squash, as it was originally eaten, had a very small flesh. The squash wasn't very fleshy because actually the most nutritional dense and energy dense part of the whole squash is the seeds. So people are growing squash to eat the seeds more than eat the flesh. But of course, if we go to the supermarket or the farmer's market or whatever, people are often focused on eating the flesh of the squash. But that wasn't the original sort of way that squash were grown and developed thousands of years ago. I'm sort of going chronologically, but we have a cotton, the particular kind of cotton that was grown in this region, domesticated maybe about a little over 5,000 years ago, again in Mesoamerica, making its way up into this region about 3,000 years ago as well. And that form of cotton that was grown in the Southwest, interestingly, one of the places where it's grown is the most prevalent today is in Australia, right? So the cotton that's native to this area is now primarily grown in Australia because of its ability to survive in a very dry and cold climate, right? So and also that there's some of the evidence is that cotton was grown for the seeds, for the oil in the seeds, before it was really used for weaving purposes. But that's something that archaeologists argue about. I'm not going to get into the mix of that. So another key plant that was domesticated and brought up into this area, it's not clear how long ago, because any of you that are farmers that have grown amaranth know that it doesn't take much for amaranth to get started and grow everywhere. It's part of a whole family of related plants that have little tiny seeds that are full of energy. And so these plants stretch way back into the depths of time and were incredibly important in Mesoamerica, and of course, very important in this area as well. I had the opportunity to visit a place in Utah where some of the related plants of the family were being harvested and roasted. There was this huge sort of field of stones that were burned by fire roasting that had come from roasting these seeds. So it's very important food plant for thousands of years as well. And of course, beans, a very old plant, also domesticated around the same time as corn, perhaps a little bit earlier, but didn't make it up into this area, or at least the evidence isn't found for it in this area until about 2,500 years ago. And of course, many varieties of beans. I just show one variety here, but that being a very critical plant that's also tied into the adoption of ceramics, because if you think about it, it's very, very hard to grow, to cook beans in a basket, right? So it involves a very fine basket with very tight weaving, and the moving of hot rocks in and out using like a stick pincers, right? In and out of the basket to keep it boiling for however long it takes beans to cook, right? So I've never cooked beans in a basket, but cooking beans on the stove takes hours and hours and hours. I can only imagine cooking beans in a basket, moving hot rocks back and forth, right? And so you see that when beans come into the area, people start making ceramics pretty much at the same time, right? So those two things are very much tied together. The other one that's not for eating, but is used for tools and a whole slew of other things, are bottle gourds, which are also domesticated perhaps about 10,000 years ago. In Mesoamerica reached this area at least by about 2,300 years ago. So one thing I like to focus on as well is that this is a list, a chart that comes from the late Linda Cordell, who was an archaeologist centered in Santa Fe. But I really like to share this with my students because it shows the calories from different plants, okay? So you can see some agricultural plants at the top, and you can see that corn has a lot of calories and beans has a lot of calories. Squash, though, if you're just eating the flesh, you can see not a lot of calories there. You have to eat your body weight in squash to stay going for a day, right? But if you look down onto the wild plants that were gathered wild plants, a lot of those have a lot of calories, right? So you look at the Chenopodium family, which includes quinoa and a whole slew of other plants, 340 calories. That's like on the same level as beans, right? But then we look at, say, Indian rice grass, the little seeds from that rice grass, 410 calories, right? And then we go down into the fruits. Of course, saguaro, which doesn't grow in this area, has tons of calorie, right? Well, you can see yucca has a lot. Pinon, 635 calories per 100 grams, right? So there's some plants that grow in this area that are loaded with calories, right? And so one of the things that archaeologists look at is, why would anybody that is successful as a gatherer, not as a farmer, successful as a gatherer, what would incentivize anyone to become a farmer? Because actually, it's not really to use a business term, which is a terrible term to use, your return on investment is not particularly great in terms of raw calories, right? And so archaeologists are always thinking about this because they see that in the archaeological record that people in general are not really motivated to become farmers for thousands of years. And when people do become farmers, their neighbors decide to stay as gatherers, that the farming life doesn't appeal to them. Now, I might be talking to a bunch of farmers here who might think of a number of reasons why being a farmer might have some downsides, right? And we have some perhaps understanding of sweat equity that's involved with farming and the risks involved. Before you all came in, we're talking about the snow on the mountains and whether we might get more snow, right? These kinds of concerns, when you dedicate yourself to being a farmer, you're involved in a risky proposition because in a high desert environment, things could go very badly. And if you have focused all your energy on farming, that could be a problem, right? And so that could be quite risky, but peoples did decide to be farmers. And this is where the archaeology part will leave off here, because there's also the very important cultural element in this, in that when people were adopting corn and these other agricultural plants as they were moving out of Mesoamerica, they were not, this did not happen in terms of someone coming up and saying, hey, here's a seed. It requires 120 frost-free days. It grows in these soils with these pH levels. It has these sort of requirements of water levels per year and all of that. No, people were saying this is a sacred being, and no two ways about it. Maize is always considered, and all the crops, to be very sacred beings. So he said, this is a sacred being. If you want to engage in a relationship with this sacred being, you have to sing these songs. You have to do these prayers. You have to believe the world is this way. So I always remind my students and even archaeologists, saying the so-called Neolithic revolution, right? The adoption of agriculture, as it's called by archaeologists, is not just about finding suitable crops to grow in a particular environment. It's about a complete transformation of culture to believe in the world being entirely different than the way you believed it was before. All right. So another way to think about it is becoming a farmer is, in essence, converting to a new religion. And that's the way that, as you see corn spread across North America, you can see, in essence, the religion of corn following it wherever it goes. You see the same kinds of things popping up in the Mississippian region, as you see in Mexico, as you see in Yucatan Peninsula, as you see in the Andes of South America, as you see here in the Southwest itself, that one doesn't just become a farmer, one converts to being a farmer. One adopts the entire worldview of what it means to be a farmer, and everything that's connected with it, right? And a belief in the divine nature of those crops that persist all the way to this day, right? That I remember going out to help my great uncle, right? When I was a little kid. He was a World War II veteran. He had lost his leg to a landmine. So he would come over to our house here in the Pueblo, and he would come and pick me up. And he would have me go and help him out with his fences or whatever he needed helped out with, right? And he would remind me, saying, when you go into your field, when I was just a little kid, and this is the way that these instructions passed over generations, over thousands of years, saying, when you go into that field, greet the plants in the field as your own children. They are your own family members that you're taking care of for this year, and that you should talk to them just as you would talk to your own children, and sing them songs so that they'll be happy. And you reach out and touch their leaves, because that's the way that we can greet each other and be in relationship with each other, right? And so those are the kinds of instructions that were on the seed packet, so to speak. It didn't say anything about 120 frost-free days and what ecological zones or anything like that, saying, you want to take care of these kids? Well, you're going to have to change everything about the way you live your life in order to be the ones who take care of these children. And you're going to have to dedicate, just as a parent dedicates their whole life when you have kids. It's not just, oh, cool, I have kids, but you're dedicated to your kids for the rest of your life or their life, right? The same with your agricultural crops, right? And to pray every day for them to be well and to grow strong, and have a good life, right? So we're talking about a very different kind of approach to farming, especially when we look at massive agricultural product farming that goes on today, right? Look at how dramatically different that is in conception, right? about what if you had 20,000 acres of corn? How are you going to be able to greet all of your kids, right? How are you going to be able to talk to all of your kids, right? So it's a very different kind of way of approaching, right? And it also involves a different kind of engagement with place, right? And any of you that have ever walked almost anywhere in any of the hills here in northern New Mexico will perhaps have run into some of these grid gardens. And we can see a nice example here, which is near modern day Pueblo. And I saw earlier that there's some representatives from the farmers market from Pueblo. So perhaps you've seen this spot too, which is near modern day Cuyamongue, Cuyamugue, Owinge in Tewa, which is one of our ancestral villages. And surrounding all of the hills there are these gardens. And you can see, if you look closely, a sort of squarish shape ringed or enclosed by rocks, right? To catch water from the rainfall and hold it inside these grid gardens, right? These grid gardens are covered all over the place here in northern New Mexico, all the hills and everything like that. And the way that they're situated is also really important to keep track of in terms of capturing those microclimates to make sure that your kids have a nice little house here where they can grow in an area that's watching carefully for, well, where does the wind blow this way? Where does the water tend to fall? Where does it tend to flow? So that these kids can have the best house here, right? And so you'll see many, many examples of that. And that also these foundations are laid out the same, these grid gardens are laid out in the same way as the foundations of the houses for people. So one of the humorous things is early archaeologists actually thought these were the foundations of houses. And they were like, wow, just about everything was covered with houses. And then they came to realize that these were actually gardens, right? Fields. And you can also kind of from the picture get a sense of the scale of the field, because you're growing not 100 acres of corn all in one spot, but you're growing this little plot over here and another little plot over here, and you're growing some beans over in that little valley over there and some cotton over here, right? So if there is an early frost in this little microclimate, it doesn't impact all of your crop areas, right? So this is what you would call in modern day language risk management, right? You're like spreading around the risk into many little kind of plots, right? Spread over many different areas, right? So, but also with that adoption of agriculture, really starting to get going around 500 CE, so about 1500 years ago, the architecture in the area that the sort of ancestral Puebloan architecture was centered on pit houses that were slowly became more and more substantial over time. And so when people and the adoption of agriculture really starts to take off about 1500 years ago, and you can see that it's not just an adoption of a whole worldview, but it also transforms the architecture into something that we could recognize as Pueblo architecture today, right? So you have, by the time that beans are really adopted, that you get above ground adobe jacal architecture with pit houses that become later on known as kivas, right? And with a plaza or town square area and room blocks. So agriculture changes everything, including the architecture, right? Into something that is readily recognizable today. This is my community at Santa Clara, where you have our plaza area and the houses surrounding it. On the right-hand side is from the 1930s, and you can see it's about harvest time. You can see a lot of the same crops that came into this area thousands of years ago with the maize, the corn on the rooftop, and all of these squashes, all these calabazas, right? that we have. This is actually on my great grandmother's roof right here, where my great aunts still live in this section of the village on the right hand side there. So that was probably my great grandmother's crops right there, right? And they had just brought those in. You can see people drying racks all over the place in chili ristras that are being dried out there, right? So this is all part of the architecture, and you can see that as well, like the rooftops of the houses are important places for the drying of crops and preparation and all of that, right? So of course, that jumped past the time period of colonialism. So it's also important to recognize the impacts of colonialism and the adaptions and adoptions of colonialism on the agricultural traditions in New Mexico, right? And in the Southwest, right? So of course, I always like to point out there's two different waves of colonialism. You have the colonialism that started in 1540 when Coronados entrada into New Mexico, into Arizona, New Mexico, into this region, right? Of course, Coronado didn't stick around but a couple years because he was looking for something that he didn't find. Couldn't find the cities of gold. Was a few centuries too early, because we know cities of gold is located by Pewaukee now, but he missed it by a few hundred years. Now the main colonial project really began when Don Juan de Oñate came to stay in 1598. And the most influential part of that colonial project really has to do with the picture on the right-hand side, which is one of the remnants of one of the many missions that were constructed in the first several decades after Oñate came into New Mexico. And within the first 30 years, 20 to 30 years, the records indicate that they had constructed about 60 missions in New Mexico, which, if you have ever been to any one of these old missions, and you can see a little bit from here, the scale of the mission complex with the large masonry walls, massive timber architecture, right? Just towering church that you can see in the background, even though it's deteriorated quite a bit. These mission complexes were not just a church. They had the church there, but on the side, you always had the convento, which included workshops and storage and granaries and processing places and stables and living quarters and all sorts of stuff, right? And almost immediately, one of the key things that the friars, the fathers were focused on is growing the crops that were necessary to conduct mass for the Eucharist, right? So you needed to grow wheat, you needed to grow grapes, you needed to have vineyards to make wine. And so you needed to have those things that were necessary for mass, right? And so they brought a lot of the different kinds of crops that were, at least at first, very important for the mass. And you can see in the early records, which is really interesting to read, certain pueblos specialize, and they built these missions primarily in Pueblo communities because one of the key purposes of this colonial endeavor was to harvest souls. And that was over time, because the colony was supposed to make money, which it never did. It lost an enormous amount of money. Was an extremely costly endeavor, and the Spanish crown was always trying to figure out a way to get out of the business of New Mexico. They were like, what are we doing? Why did we go into this thing, right? But then the church would come in and say, we have all of these souls. We cannot abandon them there, so we have to keep this expensive project going. So that those 100 years, you can see that dialogue going back and forth. And of course, the priests are always arguing with the governors and things like that. I won't go down that rabbit hole, but that's always a whole thing that's part of the story as well. And part of that story as well is that the governors, in essence, they had their years as appointed governors of the colony, a lot of times their mission was to try to figure out how to make as much money as possible while they were the governor of New Mexico by forced Pueblo labor, collecting tribute from families, and collecting that tribute for the profit side of things, right? And this is where it came into conflict with the mission program of where the mission program was trying to maintain the missions and grow the crops necessary for their operation and maintenance and all of that. And so the governors are taking people, forced labor away from the pueblos to collect piñon nuts to ship back to Mexico, or collect salt to ship back to Mexico. And the church is saying, no, you can't take the people away for forced labor because we have to have them to build these massive missions, right? And so there's this whole conflict, and quite a few governors got excommunicated along the way, and so on and so forth, right? So that's a very, very colorful story of New Mexico to look into. But during this time period is when these crops were introduced, but also the tribute demands also changed the agricultural traditions. So for example, the growing of cotton was very widespread, very important activity in the Pueblo communities in New Mexico at the time that the Spanish came into New Mexico. And so even in some of the early records, some of the Spanish chroniclers said they grow a lot of cotton, and they weave them into textiles that are finer than those found in Mexico. So they were very impressed by the cotton textiles woven. And so I'm a weaver, so I kind of have to geek out on this sort of stuff. But so that those textiles were finer than those found in Mexico. And so immediately, one of the things demanded in tribute was that every Pueblo household had to provide as tribute 1 manta, which is roughly a square yard of cotton fabric every year. And so that demand would have required families to be growing tons of cotton and spending lots of time weaving that, spinning it, and weaving that just to provide tribute, not even for your own household use, but just you would spend a vast amount of time just growing cotton simply for tribute purposes, which was disastrous. So there was an option that you could provide 1 manta of cloth, or 1 buffalo hide, or a set number of antelope or deer hides in exchange instead of manta and cloth. And you can see really quickly that the growing of cotton really declined in that first century because of tribute demands. That it was too much labor to grow cotton to meet the tribute than to simply to get hides instead, right? So it's a really transformative time, right? But you can see a lot of the new foods that were brought in. Of course, you have the wheat, and you have the grapes that I mentioned already, but you also have basically most of the fruit trees that we think of today being the new foods brought in, like apples and pears and apricots, peaches, cherries. The only fruit that was the old fruit is those wild plums that grow along the acequias. Those are the predate, those are the older kind of fruit. And so, but most of the fruits that we think of today were brought in by the missions, including honeybees. Of course, there are wild honeybees in the area, right? But those added to those were the domesticated honeybees from Europe, and primarily brought for the fruit trees, right? So to help with the fruit trees. And of course, a lot of domesticated animals in the Pueblo communities. Before the Spanish, there was 2 domesticated animals, turkeys and dogs, right? And so added to this, you have a lot of other animals like horses and cows and sheep and goats and chickens and everything else, right? And then of course, other kinds of produce like melons and all different kinds of watermelons, cantaloupes, all of that, garlic and onions, right? There's a debate about chile. There are some chili-like wild plants that are relatives that were gathered as a condiment, so to speak. but that Chile was probably brought up by the indigenous auxiliaries that always came along with the Spanish. And people focus on the couple hundred Spanish colonists that came, say, with Coronado, or the Spanish soldiers that came with Coronado, or the group of colonists that came with Oñate. Those really formed a pretty small group compared to the larger group, which often are listed as like, oh yeah, and there was hundreds of porters, right, or auxiliaries, that came with them, and so in many cases outnumbering by many times over the group, right? So we know, like from the records, that the Spanish originally did not like chili very much because it was not familiar to the palate at the time, right? And so it would have been the native peoples that were really from Mexico that were really fond of chili and brought it up. So it's hard to imagine Pueblo cuisine though without chili today, but it may have come from around that time, being as widespread, right? So and so that set of new foods really persisted over time, and so that we get a lot of varieties of apples and pears and chili and melons that are over hundreds of years become acclimated to this particular environment. And one of the key elements of Spanish colonialism that's always important to note as well is that in the first decade of the 1700s, after the Pueblo Revolt, you have the War of Spanish Succession, in which the Bourbons and Habsburgs are fighting over the Spanish crown, and they kind of waste out the Spanish treasury, and the Bourbons take over the crown, but then they find out there's no money. So long story short, they realize they can't keep up the expensive project called New Mexico. And so over a series of years, they kind of extract out of New Mexico is still under the Spanish crown, but say, for example, the line of presidios that sort of set the line of northern Mexico leaves New Mexico out, right? So they're like, good luck out there, New Mexico. You're on your own. And so there's a whole period of 100 or so years where New Mexico is sort of out there. And we're all the communities of New Mexico doing our own thing, growing these crops passed down through generations, not having a lot of engagement with the authorities in Mexico City or Madrid, right? And so then you have another wave of colonialism that brings in a whole new sort of element. And so American colonialism in the Baskin-Robbins flavors of colonialism has its own flavors, its own nuts, its own colors. And so, of course, American colonialism coming in 1848 with the conclusion of the Mexican-American War. And Americans are focused from the beginning of the United States, the inception of the United States, focused on the idea of private property, okay? And this is a very important distinction to make, that the Spanish government and Spanish colonialism, as it came to New Mexico, was basically, in essence, almost a feudal form of economic system and government, where lands are held in common, right? So you have the land grants and things like that, which is a sort of residual from that sort of perspective. And so the idea of holding lands in common worked pretty well for Pueblo communities, because our communities, each of our communities has held our lands in common as distinct communities. But the Americans right away were focused on trying to break up lands that were held in common to create the yeoman farmer, the individual farmer that has their own land and is a voter and on and so forth, right? And that was what was inscribed into the Constitution and the founding documents itself. And you could see that those founding documents were very much copied off of philosophers like John Locke, who were true believers in the idea of private property. And of course, the Americans also had, by the time they invaded New Mexico had significant manufacturing centers in the eastern areas. So we're bringing in a lot of new tools and new technologies and things like that to New Mexico, where those tools were really not accessible prior to the Americans invading. And so the Americans set about to break up lands held in common, to break them into private property, and also to focus in on how private property should be handled, you know. And so in terms of impact on indigenous peoples across the United States, starting in the second half of the 1800s, the United States started the Indian industrial schools. The first one was in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, very famously created by Captain Henry Pratt, who is often quoted as saying that the schools were designed to kill the Indian and save the man. And Captain Pratt was a veteran of the Civil War, military guy. He built the first industrial school at a military fort. And he believed that the way to kill the Indian and save the man was to use a military school type model to bring Native kids away from their communities and put them into these military complexes and cut their hair and strip them of their culture and things like that. And a very key part of this is, and this is Albuquerque Indian School pictured here. It looks like it could be Fort Union or Fort Stanton or Fort Defiance or wherever. It has a parade ground with a gazebo in the middle for the bandstand, right? For the students to parade out for roll call and all of that. The various barracks and officers' quarters and commandant's quarters, right? But then surrounding it are all of these school buildings, which were like workshops for like training people how to be cobblers and saddlers and coopers. And also they had a program where the students in the summer months would be loaned out as like sort of free labor to farmers to teach them the American way of agriculture with the new technology that they had at hand at that time, right? And so these schools were really intended to create like sort of, there was a belief at that time that that the students weren't capable of advanced academic learning, so to speak. And so that's why they included all of these elements. They say, well, before anybody can sort of advance in the so-called ways of civilization, you have to be a good individualistic yeoman farmer in the American model with private property, large tract of land with the most advanced equipment, farming those plots of land. And so that's what they were training young Native students to do. And then it was also very gendered as well, because they say, okay, the boys, you go out and you do the farming and the saddle making and the cooper making and all of that, the barrel making. And then the girls were taught in housekeeping skills, right? And they would lend out the girls to families to serve as like basically maids in households, right? And so this system of education was pretty impactful on a lot of Native communities in terms of transferring a different way of agriculture, and was very damaging to a lot of communities. In fact, my great grandpa went to Albuquerque Indian School, which is pictured here. I'm not totally sure, but usually in the scheme of things, this little building where my cursor is the guardhouse, basically like a jail. I'm not sure if that's entirely accurate, but in the usual model, this is always the guardhouse right here. And this is for imprisoning little kids, right? Who are trying to run away home. And my great grandpa would actually run away from Albuquerque Indian School when he was a little kid. He would run all the way from Albuquerque to Santa Clara, right? And apparently there was a cave near modern day San Ildefonso Pueblo, like a place where he would run from Albuquerque to there, spend the night, go eat at his relative's house in San Ildefonso, and then cross the river and be home. And spend a little time with his family before the authorities caught up with him, would arrest him and take him back and probably throw him into that building right there, that little guardhouse, right? And so this is part of that sort of American colonialism and trying to change how agriculture was done, right? Now, I will argue that generally this was not successful. And in fact, there was a 1928 Merriam report that concluded that as soon as students left the schools, they typically would go back to their home communities and resume their lives as Native peoples, right? And government authorities usually would complain about it and call it going back to the blanket. They would say, for all of our efforts at trying to turn Native peoples into yeoman farmers, only a handful of them decide to go that route. Most of them just go back to their communities and go back to living as Native peoples, right? So the destructive elements of the boarding schools can't be understated, but also their effects could be overstated as well, because you always get all of these letters from the Indian agent, the local Indian agent, complaining about Pueblo communities refusing to merge small plots of land into larger plots to use American technology. And then when they give American technology to Pueblo communities, they would just give it, not use it for the purpose defined, right? So for example, Americans love fencing, right? And so one of the first things they wanted to do is have everybody put fences up to follow John Locke's private property philosophy. And there was one of the stories in the early 1900s, they gave my Pueblo like thousands of yards of wire to build fences at a huge cost. And Pueblo we just gave it away, like sold it for a fraction of its value to some other people, right? They're like, we don't need fences. We have the wild plums that define the small little garden lots. We don't need this stuff, right? But we'll sell it for a fraction of its value and use it for our own needs, right? So the Indian agents were always complaining about that, right? Now, I always put as a major marker in the change of things as World War II, in the sense that World War II is a huge transformative time and in introducing a lot of new kinds of foods and the changing in practice, not just for Pueblo communities, but here in New Mexico in general, right? But you get more Pueblo men served in World War II per capita than any other ethnic group in the United States. So I'll say that again. More Pueblo men served in World War II than any other ethnic group in the United States on a per capita basis. Not in raw numbers, but per capita. So more people were involved in that time period in terms of going outside of the community than had ever happened before. And we're engaging in things like military rations, but also helping in the shipyards in Seattle and the manufacturing centers in Chicago and all of these places, right? Even if they weren't actually involved in the military side of things directly, right? And so they're engaging in new practices and canned foods and processed foods. Suddenly there's this huge new access to sugar, right? And then, of course, the advent and spreading of refrigeration in the years after, right? So I like this picture here because this is an ultimate result of World War II, right? This is a widespread food item that you would find if you ever went to almost any Pueblo feast day. You would be remiss to not see some kind of Jello type dessert on the table. And that's a direct result of the time period following World War II with the spread of these kinds of different kinds of foods, highly refined, lots of sugar. And of course, you can't make Jello without refrigeration, right? Those are not, you need it to be cold enough. And so you can see it in terms of not just the diet, but even in the farming stats. I know this is a table full of lots of numbers on here, but you can see on the left-hand side, all of the different Pueblo communities in New Mexico. You can see in 1938, on the eve of World War II, right, before the war, right? And then you can see as you track across the chart there, going all the way up, the chart's not super, oops, sorry. I'll go back. It doesn't come all the way up to today, but into the 80s, you can see the number of irrigated acres and how they decline for the most part. In some communities, they actually increase, but for the most part, you see a large decline in irrigated acres. And at the bottom, you can see the totals all the way up to 1964. And that's because there's some missing numbers for the 80s, right? So not including that, but you can see in the 20 years after World War II, in essence, because you can see about 17,000 acres, irrigated acres before World War II, drops down to 11,000 by 1964, which is a 30% decline. And then you can see for the individual pueblos across the board here that goes, what some of those declines look like is much larger. For example, Laguna, you have an 85% decline in irrigated acreage, right? Tesuque, 62%, right? Some of the numbers probably might be, there might be some data problems. For example, my pueblo, Santa Clara, is 87% increase. So I think somebody didn't do the numbers right. Something happened there. But in some cases, there could be increases as some communities also shift away from agriculture focused on food, direct, corn and beans and squash and wheat and things like that, to for-profit sort of monetary agriculture focused on alfalfa for animal feed, right? So merging acreage together and focusing on that might explain some of the increases in certain places, right? Or changes in certain places. But overall, you can see World War II having that dramatic decrease, reduction in farming, right? Now, in one thing I want to sort of wind up my thoughts and sort of, I covered like 10,000 years in the last 40 minutes. And so that's a lot of things I left out, a lot of different elements to sort of, we flashed through history at a very quick speed, right? When we think about how we practice agriculture in particular places, and especially for indigenous communities, what that means for sovereignty, right? As inherent sovereignty, as communities, looking to sort of maintain who we are as people. Like I said, agriculture is not just planting crops. It's about a way of viewing the entire world that involves a deep relationship with place, a dedication to service and engagement with not just the people of that place, but all of the beings of that place, and the ways that the environment is in that place, the way that the snows come and the rains come, and how we engage with those, right? And what does that mean for who we are as people, right? And also to think about colonialism as an ongoing project, that colonialism as part of the ongoing project, that's a structure, not an event. And that as an ongoing structure looks to flatten out the relationships that people have with their places, right? So all around the world, people as farmers, even as gatherers, we have had deep and rich relationships with the places that we have lived, right? Whereas colonialism as a structure and as a project seeks to flatten out those relationships and remove those relationships, right? So that you could walk into a Walmart here in Espanola, or Walmart in Mexico, or Walmart in Massachusetts, or Walmart in San Francisco, and it doesn't matter which Walmart you're in, because you'll find the same sorts of things around the same sorts of prices, and it has no relationship with the local place, right? And the same with a whole variety of box stores and things like that, where if I want to buy a peach, I can go in there into these warehouses called supermarkets, and I can buy a peach whenever I feel like it, right? No, irregardless of whether peaches should be growing where I'm living at right now, right? And what is our relationship with those poor children that fill up those warehouses, right? Who have been grown in factory conditions and shipped across the world, right? And what does that tell us about that project, and how, like you all, engaged with farmers markets and producing fresh and local crops, right? that are deeply engaged with what it means to grow those crops in the places that you live at. What does that mean as sort of a feedback mechanism to the project of colonialism, right? And the work that you all are engaged in as very powerful and critical work that is profoundly speaking back to those processes that have been going on for centuries now, right? So anyway, I wanted to leave those thoughts there. And I know the last slide I showed before this showed a decline in agriculture. And I know we're here on Zoom because of the global pandemic and COVID-19, right? But I would say, like, in terms of planting seeds of hope, so to speak, one of the cool things to see, at least here at Santa Clara, Polo, that because of the pandemic, more people were planting than I had ever seen in my lifetime, right? In fact, my mom always sends out a call to the Pueblo every spring saying, hey, anyone that wants to grow native seeds, come in and get them. There's no cost, right? Just come in and get them. And the only ask is that you save the seeds and keep them alive, right? And that you pass them down. And usually each year there would just be like maybe one or two people, maybe, right? And during the pandemic, it was like 40, 50 people that would come and ask for seeds. All of a sudden, like many more times, more people than usual. And fields that I hadn't seen planted since I was a little kid, that people are planting in their yards, around their house, right? It was really profound to see that, that something as disruptive as a pandemic, right, could also have such really powerful reminder of and a motivator for people to re-engage and re-enter into relationships with our kids and our relatives and our places, right? And so it's really profound to see that, and also to know that I hope that some of those changes are things that we keep with us as the pandemic changes, and as our attitudes toward the pandemic changes and things change, right? So a set of references, but I won't, we'll leave on that page, but you can always ask if you want some of the resources I talked about, right? So with that, I'll stop talking and maybe open up for questions and things like that.
Thank you so much, Porter, for a great presentation and for giving us that perspective. So we have a little bit over about 40 minutes left for a question and answer period. So I'd ask individuals, if you have a question, to please place it in the chat, or if you'd like to ask it in person, to raise your hand. If we do have you raise your hand, and if you do ask a question in person, we ask that you refrain just from general discussion and make sure that you phrase it as a question so that we can get everybody's questions answered as quickly as possible. And Porter, I'll start out with one question here. So you mentioned climate change and the impact of that. Climate change is obviously going to have a huge impact on agriculture. We know, though, that since agriculture has been practiced here for millennia, that there have been other climate consequences in the past. So as I understand, back in the 1100s, there was a multi-decadal drought. I don't know if it was 30, 40 years, that had a profound impact and actually a kind of a collapse in some of the populations in the Four Corners region. Is there any evidence of how agriculture weathered that period of time of change and what occurred at that point?
Yeah, I think that's really something that's on everyone's minds, that's trying to grow, have that sort of engagement as a farmer, thinking about how do you do that when the climate is changing, and what does that mean for us, right? And also recognizing, when we look at references, I just was reading a story the other day that was relating to the current drought situations, the current long drought here in New Mexico, to that earlier drought, right? Like that. Okay, now we're like in the millennium scale drought in terms of the last times that it was this dry in the Southwest, right? And so you can see that really it does have impact on people, right? And that people, that drought also coincides with people moving out of lower land areas like in the Chaco watershed, Chaco Canyon watershed, up into the highland areas of the McElmo Dome in the Four Corners region, right? Up into like areas that are like 7,000 feet, which have shorter growing season, right? But because they're higher elevation, you're getting a little bit more rainfall. You're getting maybe an inch or two more rainfall. So, so that you're adapting to changing environments by physically finding relocating to a different location, right? And so that's one of the really challenging thoughts to think about. And I think we're already seeing with the news stories about climate migration, right? And climate refugees, that there people are saying watch for this, right? Well, climate refugees, we would say those are the same kinds of things that we have seen as human beings, not just around here, but going all over the world through the depths of time, right? I also like to remind my students when I'm talking to say, like at one time, because one time behind my house here on the hill, there was my grandma was walking and she found a jawbone that looked like almost like a horse jawbone, right? But it was fossilized, right? And she was like, what is this fossilized horse bone? It turned out that it was a camel bone, a camel jaw, right? So it was a camel that was cruising around here like, I don't know, 10,000 years ago, right? And some farmer like 500 years ago had put it as a marker on a grid garden, had set it as the marker on the edge, this fossilized jawbone, right? So, but it just goes as a reminder that people like us, we're also in this walking around this area when this area was like, had swamps and megafauna, giant sloths, and that whole world transformed, right? Like in a way that we can't even imagine how this place looks so different. And yet people are still figuring out how to not only survive in that radically changing climate, but also figured out ways to thrive, right? So I guess there's always a way of hope that we as human beings have figured out ways to figure it out along the way. So.
Thank you, Porter. Another question here. How do native farmers deter deer from eating their crops without fences?
So it's a good question. One of the things that was customary even all the way till even in my younger years was that when you're farming, you would build you'd have like a farm house. It's not like really a full farm house, but more like a little built up ramada where you would live basically away from the village and the fields, depending how far away your field was. And that everybody in the family would go down into that area, right? And so the little kids who can't contribute that much to the heavy labor of farming, part of your job is to keep those rabbits and deer and all of that out of the field. And if you're living there in your field, you're also keeping animals away because animals just generally don't like to be that close with us people, right? So it's a deterrent, right? So you're there. But so even my job as a little kid, some of it was to herd turkeys. We grew we had the wild turkeys that we kept. And so we would herd those turkeys and, they eat grasshoppers and stuff like that. So you take them through the gardens and stuff like that and keep track of them, right? Because you gotta keep watch after them, right? And then of course, you would go in, my great uncles and older generations too always talk about, you would snare animals and that would be bothersome to your crops, right? So you have your hunting rabbits and things like that, eating rodents, right? Today, like in the supermarket, there's usually like 3 varieties of meat that are for sale: chicken, pork, and beef, right? Those are the meats, so to speak, in America, so to speak. Those are like the way that meat is sort of constructed in the supermarket. But we see, going back into the past, people would eat all sorts of things, right? And so even in these ancestral Pueblo villages, a lot of the bones that are found are rabbit bones, all sorts of rodents, right? You keep eating rodents, that's maybe one of the main meats with rodents, right? And you help keep down your issues with that, right? So.
And Porter, I take it that you're going to allow us to share your slides or your presentation. We can make that available for folks. I have a question here that they want to be able to refer back to it and use that to help others.
I think this is being recorded, this presentation as well. So so I could certainly PDF the slides too to share, but probably most useful as a presentation.
Terrific. If anybody else has any questions, you could raise your hand. Let's see, Denise, you have a question. If you could unmute.
Thanks for reminding me about that. Thanks, Porter. That was really wonderful. It's the second time I've heard you didn't go into quite as much detail, I think, the last time, but I learned something new again listening this time. And you reminded me of a quote I just recently read, which it said, "An intellectual says a simple thing in a hard way, an artist says a hard thing in a simple way." And I think you're probably both an artist, an intellectual, but this presentation is really, you could tell it's very, it comes from the artistic side of you, I think, because you really are able to, get things down to that essence and help shine a light on some really fundamental things that so many of us work with in different ways. My question is, it kind of, I think, maybe even reflects a little bit of the person who said they want to share back bits of this presentation on social media and to educate their followers. And I guess my question, because at the Farmers Marketing Association, so much of what we try to do has to do with educating the public and really spurring that the love for locally grown food that you spoke about, with both the personal knowledge as well as throughout history, and how throughout history there were different reasons that people were spurred to become farmers or grew foods, and how things changed. Everything affects everything else. So just like I think you mentioned that that farming affected architecture, well, architecture and housing affects farming, but how can we, the NMFMA and all of the choir who are gathered here today, like how can we spread the message that how do we bring back, I think a lot of it is, it's percolating out there, like you mentioned with the pandemic, there's been, that the interest in seeds that you mentioned, that your mom has offered, there's been an interest in local food, maybe things go in a cycle because of all of the post-World War II industrialization of food, people have come to really, want to get back, but how do we find those things that can really spark the spiritual needs and the health and the connection to the land, all the things that you talked about so beautifully, but how do we do that out in the public? And yeah, it's kind of a big question, but can you help us? How do we do it?
Well, speaking to the choir, because you all are already advocates by the fact that you're here today, right? And involved in the work that you do, that you all are already advocates. But I kind of go back to the quote I had on my last slide there about what does it mean to advocate on a large scale versus on a local scale, right? And so I have a hard time thinking about what is it to try to convince everybody in New Mexico to do this, right? Well, that's too big of a job for any one person or any one of us, or even perhaps even all of us as a group. Maybe we could aspire to that, right? But what is really, really critical is the work that you all are doing in your particular locales, right? So I saw comments earlier that some of you are coming from really different parts of the state, right? And so I think I saw somebody from Carlsbad, right? someone down in the south part of the state, and I see some people from the north western part of the state. So really different parts from where I'm at, right? Really different parts of the state. And so what does it mean to sort of advocate in that particular region, right? Because even within our state, we're not that big of a place, but we're still a really big place, lots of differences, right? I remember growing up without electricity here at the Pueblo, and you know, our day started with the sun and ended with the sun, you know, how that goes. And so when I was a teenager, my teenage rebellion was I told my mom that I wanted to go back to school. I didn't want to be home anymore. And so that was my rebellion. So I went to school. I said, I don't want to go back to just school too. I want to go to military boarding school. And you can't stop me. That was my teenage rebellion, right? So like total opposite, different direction. And so I went to New Mexico Military Institute in Roswell. And I remember the absolute horrific sensation I felt as the bugle was playing on the first morning and the dawn hadn't barely even started, right? And as Reveille was playing, I noticed the sun was rising on street lamps. And it had never occurred to me that the sun could rise on street lamps because I grew up here, right? And the sun rises and sets on mountains. And I realized, oh my gosh, I've made a terrible, terrible mistake. That sinking sensation. That doesn't mean that there's anything inherently wrong with the sun rising on the not on mountains, right? It just means that from a place I felt like, oh wow, I really don't know. This is a different planet. Roswell is not anything remotely similar to where I come from, right? And I am a total foreigner here, right? And that's part of New Mexico. That's not really that far. I could drive there in a few hours, right? And some of you may be from that part of the state, right? And so no offense at all to those of you over there, but it makes me want to say, you know, your areas where your ecological regions and your engagement with that particular place and the peoples of that place is so much important in the work that you do. Just as when I'm here at my Pueblo, you know, I'm advocating for how these things are not disconnected from each other. That's why in my mind, I can't separate the worldview from being a farmer, from houses, from our annual calendar and the cycle and all of that. You can't separate any of that, right? So we're advocating, from my perspective, I'm advocating for the continuation of us as a people, right? And our particular approach to what it means to be a human being in our particular area, in our language that we speak and everything like that, right? Not for sharing with it, not as a guide for anybody else in the world, right? Like this is like the way we human in our particular part of the world, right? Now there's the ways people have figured out how to human in their particular areas. And so it's so much important for people to think about that in terms of so much about what it means to be local is to take that serious, right? And so it's a little bit like, it's a little bit tricky to globally say be local, but perhaps by really dedicating oneself to being local, you are advocating on a global scale, and you're talking back to global forces, right? That's my kind of long way of saying, you know, like how important it is that one message, one voice can't be the voice. That one voice is really just one voice, right? While all of you doing the hard work in your own areas, in your own regions, and that engaging in a deep level with your own places, it is a big difference there, right? Not adopting someone else's worldview, not taking someone else's worldview, and not taking the way people have figured out how to thrive somewhere else, but realizing that your own engagement with place is very, very important.
All right, Porter, I have another question here. This is from Jackie from Rama. She said, could you talk a little bit about the concept of querencia? This is what I use to try to persuade people to change their thinking about agriculture.
Well, I didn't bring it up at all in my presentation, so that was you didn't miss it. But I think a little bit of what we're doing right now could fit under that sort of scheme of querencia, right? And thinking about and what you all will be doing this week, right? But I think sometimes when you're like standing on your soapbox, preaching on the corner, right? Sometimes that doesn't have as good of effect as when you're going and having discussions on the porch with your relatives, as the sun's coming up, right? Sitting in the sun under the porch and having those conversations, and what does that mean to engage with people on that level? I think that's where change really starts to happen, is on that really intimate level of, hey, you wanted to grow something? Well, we have some seeds, right? You don't go to the feed store. We have some over here too, right? But even if you go to the feed store, that's all right. But maybe next time you could get seeds here, or having those kinds of discussions, right? And so I think you all are going to be engaged in that. I don't know what more to say, and perhaps Juan, you have perhaps more to add to that as well yourself.
Yeah, for those folks who aren't familiar with the term, querencia is essentially, I guess, a love of place. And it's an attachment that people develop to the land that surrounds them. So in a sense, it is, you are part of the land. I mean, it goes deep in the sense that you are of the land and the land is of you. So it's a relationship. And so I think querencia, the best way to describe it is just a relationship to land. And this relationship is more than just, well, the land, I can use that to grow stuff. It's about respect for honoring the land and what the land can contribute to you. And it's also about caring for the land so that after you're gone, someone else can be there and also have that love and relationship to the same land. So that goes on. So the land kind of outlasts you, so to speak, and has a greater spirit than what you have. And so I think for a lot of people, there's this attachment to land and this realization that the land is what provides for us to survive. And so it is a love relationship with land. Are there any other questions that folks have that they would like to bring up, or any points people would like to bring up? If so, raise your hand or put your question in the chat. I think that's it. I don't see any other questions. Denise, I'll turn it back to you. And again, for everyone here, this session is recorded and will be available on the YouTube channel. So you have access to all of the information that was presented here. And Porter, again, I want to really thank you for sharing your wisdom and the fact that, again, agriculture has been practiced here for millennia, means that we have a lot to learn and that we have a lot of history to really guide us in our processes of going forward in agriculture in New Mexico.
Thank you all for inviting me here. It's really great to join you all this morning, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your conference as well.
Yeah, thank you, Porter, and thank you, Juan, for facilitating that. I just want to let people know that we have until 11 a.m. scheduled, because we thought that, a 2-hour block of time on Zoom is probably enough before we let people take a break and then, walk away, go for a short walk, or just focus on something away from the screen. And then we come back at noon. We will come back at noon. But I do want to invite people, if you just want to hang out here, since one of the most valuable things we do not have the opportunity to do, since we're not meeting in person, is just that talking over a cup of coffee, the hallway chat. If you want to just hang out here, please feel free to hang out here until at least 11, and we can, have an informal. It doesn't have to relate to Porter's presentation. We can just say, hey, how you doing? What's happening in Carlsbad? What's happening in, different areas around the state? And then we can take that break right at 11. So, or if you'd like to start your break earlier, please feel free to save 20 minutes or so. You've got about 20 extra minutes here. So we wanted to just give enough space. So often we feel pressured into these time constraints, and we've got to kind of live by our clocks and our calendars, but we wanted to make sure we had enough time to allow for any questions or discussions. So again, you can either, if you do decide to break off, I think that there are a couple of things that we just want to remind you, and that will be that in the afternoon, so starting at noon, you would come back and there will be a state of the plate presentation that I will do. We'll also from 1 to 1:30 have our board elections, or at least the introduction of the new potential board members to all of you, as well as information about how to vote this week. So we hope you will definitely be there for that. And if you're not able to come back at that time, you will have received a link in your email so that you are able to vote. All members of the NMFMA can have one vote that you will have all week until the end of the day on Friday to be able to vote for new board members. So I just want to mention that. And then later in the day, we have what I'm sure will be a really great session starting from 1:30 to 3:30 with Sarah Silva. And Sarah is how do I describe her? She has 18 years of experience in community organizing. And the first session that she's going to do for us today is going to have to do with conflict resolution, which is something that I think every market manager has probably had to deal with at your markets, and all of us humans, as part of any organization, unfortunately, sometimes we end up needing to think about conflict resolution, and she will bring an equity lens to the discussion. So that'll be from 1:30 to 3:30. So we hope if you take a break now, you'll come back at lunch. It'll be okay if you want to eat a sandwich or, eat with us at noon, that's fine too. So yeah, we just look forward to seeing you later today and the rest of the week, but hang out here if you feel like just chatting a little bit, and I'll stop talking now. Sylvia. Oh, you're on mute, Sylvia.
We do come from different cultures, and we cannot have control over where we all were born. And in that sense, I feel it's really important in the narrative to bring forward, because we're living in the present, bring forward the good things from all our different cultures. That yes, there was conflict, and it continues to be in the world. But I think if we continue to hang on to that conflict, that we can never discuss and bring together the good things from all our different cultures to really move forward into a better future. There's not enough conversation. And I wish there could be. I wish it could be a safe space where all people can begin to grow like seeds, their dignity, that all people can leave behind their shame, that all people can leave behind their hurt, and that we can begin to grow something that maybe is wonderful and new about our entire species. That's my statement.
Thank you, Sylvia. I think that's really extremely relevant. We all do bring so much to our work and to our communities, our different communities. I think that's really important. And I hope over the next few days, everyone will feel comfortable sharing and telling your own stories for sure. I think, you know, I know Porter, with your presentation, it was really lovely to be able to hear some of that direct connection to your childhood, but we all have different, you know, different experiences about where we've come from and how we've gotten to where we are, and they're all super relevant. So thank you, Sylvia.
It was a beautiful presentation, but you know, we need to have a reflection on also people who were fleeing the Inquisition. We need to look at the past. Also, there were alliances. There were people who were friends from the different cultures. We need to admit there was some sharing of our cultures. And where was, there was love. There was some love amid all of this terrible experience. And we need that, because like right now, I think what's very difficult is the impact of the casinos that's having a tremendous impact on all our communities. And there's a great silence about that. There's a great silence in our cultures, in our speaking, that we need to become able to address for our families, you know, for all of our futures. But that discussion hasn't happened, but I'd love to see it begin to happen. That's it.
You know, we can learn so much just from listening to each other. And during Porter's presentation there, where he was talking about the migration of various foods from the Central Valley of Mexico and going this direction, there was also exchange going in the other direction. So there's, you know, exchanges going in both directions. But to me, the most fascinating thing would have been to be there present when someone is handing over seeds of corn to someone else and saying, here's this I'm going to share with you. I mean, that must have been the most of interesting conversations to understand how that gift then would have been spread and shared. And so that goes kind of to what you're talking about, Sylvia, and that is we need to learn how to listen and to share from the experiences and from the knowledge of others, and not always assume that we as individuals already know everything and understand everything, because probably we're all deficient in some respect or another. And so we really need to depend on others if we want to evolve as humans. You can't do it by yourself.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any other comments from? Oh, go ahead, Porter.
I would just jump in. I know I'm done presenting, but I think Sylvia, I appreciate your comments, and I always because every so often I get to the opportunity to teach Pueblo history, right, at the Institute of American Indian Arts, and when I teach that, you know, I really do focus on those sort of relationships that develop. You know, I was kind of staying away from some of that in today's presentation, trying to stay, how can I stay on agriculture more specifically in that relationship, right? But I always like to bring up the 1837 Chimayo, so-called Chimayo rebellion, right, as an example, right, where all these local communities in northern New Mexico joined together, you know, to keep out sort of these dictates that were coming from Mexico City at that time, that would have impeded on local customs and local sort of practices of governing, right? And also that not many people know about that that event, right? Not even in New Mexico, a lot of people have never heard of the 1837, the events of 1837-38. And then there was Inizaro, who was our governor for a moment there until Manuel Armijo came back and took him out. But, you know, there was a nice example of that unity, right, between groups, right? And also even when the Americans invaded when the Mexican government abandoned New Mexico, right? Once again, Armijo took off and just bailed on New Mexico, and the peoples joined together to, without any formal support or anything, to keep out the invaders. Everybody, the Pueblos and all the communities in northern New Mexico, right? We're all together. You know, those are the kinds of things that people forget too often, that this was very important, right? When we look at Mr. Gonzalez, who was the Unicero governor, right? He had comadres and compadres in all these different towns through marriage and baptism, and he was married at Taos Pueblo, or perhaps was from Taos Pueblo. Not always totally clear on whether the records are clear on that, right? And so it's just a one story that this individual that's never talked about almost ever, and the ties of all these communities to assert our identity as communities in northern New Mexico. And that story is very often left out of the history books, right? So I think there's like a little plaque on the side of the road outside of Pewaukee, and that's about it.
Kelly, go ahead and ask your question or comment. You need to unmute.
Well, I just wanted to say that I have not lived in New Mexico my whole life. Obviously, my husband and I came here for the oil fields in Carlsbad. But I feel like I've come back to my roots because my grandmother and her family have been here for hundreds of years. And I'm just so proud to be here. But going along with the colonization and everything, I just wanted to say that we have traced back our ancestry back to Spain. And it is a really hard process going through and trying to separate yourself from the bad things that happen through that, and trying to work through it. And that is kind of one of the things that I'm trying to do in my life, is not really make up for that, but just kind of come to terms with it and not feel the guilt from knowing that some of my ancestors did those things. So it is a very important conversation for people just to know that a lot of us that do have that background, that we do feel horrible about it, and we try to do, make reparations wherever we can, and try to give back to our communities. I'm actually volunteering right now at a food bank, so but yeah, so I kind of just wanted to throw that out there, that we all do feel terrible, and we try to do the right thing, and it's not always easy.
There are a lot of uncomfortable truths in the history of New Mexico as well as the United States. And so, sweeping them under the rug or ignoring them or not acknowledging that they didn't exist doesn't really build the kind of reconciliation and the kind of dialogue that needs to occur. These are very, very difficult issues, and very heated issues. And again, I think the most important thing that we can do in this whole process is to be able to listen, and listen attentively and without judgment as people say their words. And if we can get through that, we can probably come to some kind of mutual or common understanding.
Yes, thank you. But yes, this just hearing the history and everything, Mr. Swentzell, like, that was amazing. I think just knowing a little bit of history, you hear a little bit here and there, but to hear it from his words was more moving than just reading it yourself. So we really appreciate him coming out, or at least I do. I know everybody does. So thank you very much.
Sylvia, did you have another comment?
Yes, I think that the concept of retribution is not resolvable, in my opinion. The need for retribution. In terms of how to listen, it's not just listening, in my opinion, but listening to each other. Can we listen to each other? Is there so much pain and so much an attachment to retribution that we cannot listen except through that pain? And how does that color our ability to listen? What is forgiveness and what does that mean? Does forgiveness mean giving up who we are, giving up what we value? How can we be whole human beings and be strong and be who we are? And how can we quench the fire of rage? And how can we really create a soil where we can really grow as a species? Those are my big questions. And because I think that, well, that's enough to be said, I think, right now.
We have a hand up from Shiprock. If you could unmute yourself, ask your question.
Hi, Yate. Good morning. This is Orion. I'm the farmers market manager from Shiprock. But I guess I have a comment, but we're up here in northwestern New Mexico. We actually have a lot more water than the rest of New Mexico because we have the 3 rivers converging, and we live on a huge watershed compared to the rest of, I think, everyone else. But we have seen a lot of challenges with the farming. Probably before 1995, we had, a lot of people were getting more than half their food from farmers. But now it's a more of a modern impact that we're seeing from the change of families farming and also the water situation. But my little comment is just that, so as now for Navajo people living in a more isolated, less contact area, I think there are some advantages with the Pueblo communities, working with the Spanish neighbors, is that you guys do have acequias, like a more shared understanding with the watersheds than we do for Navajo people living in a higher, on the Colorado Plateau, because it was a lot more Navajos on one side and upstream water users on the other side. And it's our water problems have only gotten sort of resolved in 2012, which is very, very recent. We're not talking about hundreds of years ago. And it was like, and to sit in those court sessions where upstream water users are demanding or just saying that Navajo people have too much water and they don't actually use it, was really, to experience that as a young person, as a young farmer, was very unsettling. It was very interesting. And then you compare that experience with New Mexico, like places like Taos, where they say, yeah, we share water, we're on an acequia, we have acequia associations. But I think that you can see where there's different situations, even within New Mexico, that maybe there's an advantage to working together with your neighbors, whereas I think here in Navajo, it's you're on one side, and then for water users, and then you're on the other side if you're an upstreamer. And that's been really the thing for the last, I mean, it's only been talked about and resolved in the last decade compared to having like a 200-year acequia association that has maintained like wells and ditches and stuff like that. Whereas here, you're kind of on your own if you're gonna clean a ditch or make sure the water is coming down the pipe. That's our situation up here on the Northwest New Mexico. But I was just gonna also say that it was really fascinating to hear Porter's talking about the wild and wild crafted foods, how calorie dense those were. For Navajo people, we do still use a lot of that. And I think in 1995, families were, probably every family was going out and picking at least a few 100 pounds of piñon, and they would share and sell and distribute. And one of the things I see with the markets is that a lot of the value doesn't come from the first person that gets or harvests things like piñon. It only gets value after a third person is involved. So for Navajo families, they still gather piñon, maybe 100 pounds of it, and they're not able to sell it because there's so many rules, but only after it's sold to a third party, and then that party puts it in a grocery store or sells it in Albuquerque or Santa Fe, does it become like 25, 30 pounds or dollars to the pound for piñon. So we're trying to work on that. And I think our association up in here in Farmington, we're trying to retain some of that value for the farmers and the growers, and also the crafters. And a lot of value does get lost with Navajo meat production. We're McKinley County and San Juan County, where we still have the largest meat and wool for mutton and the churro sheep. And a lot of that value, it doesn't stay here. It gets siphoned off in other places. Navajo growers or Navajo ranchers for sheep, they can't actually sell directly. And there are no USDA food processing here, either in McKinley County or San Juan County. So there's a whole chain that siphons off the value, and the sheep and meat get distributed way out to like on the other side of Albuquerque, and then gets resold back here locally. And then we're paying a premium because we are ourselves buyers. We're producers and buyers, but a lot of value gets lost and then gets tacked on for when a family is going to repurchase things like mutton or piñons and stuff like that. Even with our corn, yeah, it gets sold to a third party, and then they buy in bulk, and then we buy it back at a premium. That happens a lot both in McKinley County and San Juan County. That was all my comment.
Thank you for your comments. I think this brings us to a close. We're at 11 o'clock. So Denise, I'll turn it back to you for the final say here.
All right, and I might turn it back over to Michael Green for the true final say. So back at you, Michael.
All right, so thank you, Porter, for your wonderful presentation today. That was super informative for all of us. So we really appreciate the time you took to kind of put that together and share that information with us. Juan, thank you so much for moderating the Q&A at the end. It was very insightful as well. And also thanks to all the participants who came to join this morning's session. So as we've already heard a couple of times, don't forget to come back this afternoon. At 12 o'clock, we'll have the State of the Plate from Denise. And then we'll have a message from the current NMFMA board president, Hedrick Land. We'll also hear from candidates who want to join the board. And then this afternoon, we're going to have a pretty cool session on community builder skill up from Sarah Silva. So I would encourage you all to come back and join us this afternoon. And also I would encourage you just to exit out of the room, and then whenever you're ready to come back this afternoon, just use the same link to log in. You'll go back into the waiting room and we'll admit you as normal. So thank you all for joining us this morning, and we'll hope to see you this afternoon.